Hello everyone. Okay, so what I want to do with this video and the next couple videos is look a little bit more into the post-1965 trends in assimilation and pluralism that I mentioned in the previous video, but specifically now looking at how those things played out for the various groups. Specifically, we're going to look at African Americans, we're going to look at Latinos, and we're going to look at the Native Americans. So I'll do a video for each of those three groups. I'm going to start with African Americans, specifically looking at the emergence of the Black Power movement and Afrocentrism in the late 50s and 60s, even as the civil rights movement was achieving some significant gains. There was still a great deal of discontent within the African American community in the United States, and you can see that kind of reflected in the fact that the various movements, the various forms of activism within the Black community in this time period are kind of angling for something of a combination of pluralism with some elements of separatism. First of all, it's very important to keep in mind that there is not kind of a unified movement. This is a period of time in which we're watching the nonviolent, non-cooperative strategies of Martin Luther King, and Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, but we're also seeing the actions of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, and then later on, of course, Malcolm X splits with the Nation of Islam. That's a more confrontational set of principles and philosophies, and explicitly in the case of the Nation of Islam, an attempt at kind of separatism, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which is also sort of growing in size and importance in this particular period of time. So we see a number of different fronts on which these issues are kind of playing out. So the Black Power movement broadly begins in the 1960s. The working goals, when we look across all of these various groups, the working goals seem to include things like a de-emphasis on integration. Less important for these people to be integrated into or assimilated into the broader set of structural and cultural arrangements. An increase in self-determination, right? The idea that the agenda for the Black community should be set by the Black community, and full social and economic equality, sort of a push for sort of a commitment to the equal protection notions of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, that all of the laws that exist in the country to protect people will protect members of the Black community just as equally. The idea was that the goals would be achieved by placing organizations and institutions under the control of Blacks, right? So within the African American community, the establishment of locally owned businesses, schools, even farms, health clinics, things like that would be sort of all sort of organized under and run at the direction of people in the local community. So the idea of a kind of structural pluralism at work here. A lot of the spirit of this particular moment, I think, is captured in a quote that comes from Malcolm X in 1964. He's giving a press conference, and he's contrasting his style or his approach with the, as I mentioned, the nonviolent, non-cooperative strategies of people like Martin Luther King. And Malcolm X says that we, meaning African Americans, right, we should be peaceful, law-abiding, but the time has come to fight back in self-defense whenever and wherever the Black man is being unjustly and unlawfully attacked. And that's, again, you can kind of see this point at which the patience of the African American community with kind of incremental change along with the adoption of a nonviolent strategy, is sort of explicitly sort of rejected here, and you know, the terms unjustly and unlawfully had for a really long time, right? Since the arrival of African labor back in the 17th century, all the way up through the formation of the United States, and obviously the pre-Civil War and the Jim Crow eras. What constituted unjust and what constituted unlawful had always been a decision that was made by the white power structure. And for black activists in the 1960s, the idea was that they themselves would get to start to define what constitutes unjust and what constitutes unlawful. And if violence in self-defense was a means to that end, then it was justifiable in that sense. And so there's a very interesting debate kind of embedded in this, not just this quote, but the larger issue, which is who gets to define what is unjust? Who gets to define what is unlawful? Is this something that people outside the black community get to sort of impose, or is this something that you know, a body of people, a race, a social class, an ethnicity, whatever you want to call them, is this something that they get to sort of exercise some degree of self-determination toward? This, of course, is met with violent repression from the white power structure, in part because it represents a challenge to the status quo and the political and social and economic interests that are kind of built up in and around and as a result of a maintenance of the race line, and so you get this kind of era of activism that's much more confrontational and much more violent. One of the things we see, for example, in the 1960s is increasing armed patrols by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which is the full name of the organization, right? So you can see right in that name for the organization is this notion of defending themselves. So increased armed patrols by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in some Oakland neighborhoods, increased efforts to carve out self-reliance. So like, for example, the Black Panther Party in Chicago was establishing Black-owned bookstores and, as I mentioned, health clinics, food pantries, schools, lunch programs, breakfast programs, right? The idea was that a sort of self-reliance was necessary, given that even within their own communities, these people didn't feel safe or supported by the broader white-dominated local political scene. In response to this, in 1967, Ronald Reagan, who was at the time the governor of California, who would later go on, of course, to become the president of the United States, Ronald Reagan passed the Mulford Act, which was an effort to sort of take away gun rights from the African-American community, because a lot of white Californians saw these Black Panther activists and other demonstrators showing up at public events with guns, and that apparently made them very nervous. The federal government, at the federal level, they implemented a program called COINTELPRO, which is kind of an acronym or a shortened version of counterintelligence program. It was illegal. It was covert. It involved efforts to sort of infiltrate Black activist communities and Black communities broadly. It, of course, engaged in illegal surveillance and the collection of data. They worked to disrupt the activism that was occurring in the Black community, and at the very least tried to discredit a number of key leaders. So this is, COINTELPRO is aimed at a lot of different groups, not just Black activists, but socialist and communist groups, feminist organizations. So it's a really, really broad and encompassing effort on the part of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, again, illegally, to engage in this kind of data collection, surveillance, and disruption activity. All of which, of course, violate a number of constitutional amendments. So we get this COINTEL program and its activities. Often with the cooperation of local law enforcement. You get events like the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago in 1969 by the Chicago Police Department. They broke into a house where Mark Clark and Fred Hampton and several other Black Panthers were living, and they killed the guys. They killed Clark with one shot as they broke in. They assassinated Fred Hampton as he was lying in bed, drugged. None of the Black Panthers fired any shots at law enforcement. The police fired anywhere from 80 to 100 rounds in what they described as a shootout. Very one-sided shootout, obviously. And of course, local law enforcement completely exonerates any officers, any of the hierarchy, the authority and hierarchy of the police department. Nobody was held to account for this. It was just sort of a straight up assassination. The violence and the riots that are occurring at the time in response to a number of things like the murder of Martin Luther King or like the assassination of Fred Hampton, these are seen very differently, right, by by whites in the United States and by blacks in the United States. And there's this sense that several of these key figures were seen in largely positive ways, but that's not true, right? When Martin Luther King is assassinated, his sort of the number of people in the United States who saw him in a positive light was I think less than 30%. I think he had something close to 75% of the people in the United States did not like Martin Luther King, which is really weird, right? I think in the 21st century to look at somebody who is so celebrated and so lionized in our culture, to think that for a moment this guy was incredibly unpopular. But at the time of his death, as I said, he really was, because it wasn't just that he was sort of peacefully marching for, a kind of colorblind neutral society. He was an agitator. He wanted to create a society of equity. He wanted equality of outcome. He wanted people to have food and housing and clothing and shelter and all of those things. He was against the war in Vietnam. He was rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. So there are some factors that are happening globally. Speaking of Vietnam, there are some factors that are happening globally that are really having a profound impact on this particular strategy for blacks in the United States in the 1960s. The first, of course, is the Vietnam War and the draft, right? This is a time when people are being conscripted into military service. A really, really easy way to get out of military services to be a college student, but access to higher education is, as you can imagine, much more difficult for poor people and for people of color than it is at the time for whites. And so we have this ongoing conflict in Vietnam, and the vast majority of people who are being I shouldn't say the vast majority, proportionally, the majority of people who are being called up and conscripted into service are people from poor communities and communities of color. And that's seen as a pretty significant threat, especially to the younger men in the in that generation. The other is a series of ongoing post-colonial developments in African nations, right? One of the things that we sort of miss out on in our American history classes is sort of the global context in which American history is unfolding. And in the 1960s, we see among African nations a sort of emerging self-determination, right? Colonial governments are falling. European governments are withdrawing from places in Africa, and countries there are increasingly running under greater self-determination. There's It's a big continent and scores of nations, but so there'll always be a little bit of variability there. But increasingly, right, the liberation of Africa is resonating in the United States with Black people who are, of course, descended from people who were abducted and brought over during the slave trade. And the idea is a kind of an emerging Pan-Africanism or Afrocentrism, which for Blacks in the United States who can't really trace their ancestry back to a specific geographic space or a nation, in Africa, the idea is a kind of kinship with all Africans. And so what's happening globally for Blacks in Africa is creating a sense of pride and a desire for increased self-determination domestically back in the United States. When you take a step back and you look at the mixed degree of success of the Black Power movement, one of the things you can see is that part of the problem was a lack of a broad consensus, right? Some groups, like the Nation of Islam, were arguing explicitly for a more separatist model, while other groups, like the Black Panther Party and probably Martin Luther King's organizations, the organizations that are kind of aligned with his strategies and tactics, were looking probably for a more pluralistic set of solutions. Another problem that, or maybe another reason why these efforts were not a little bit more successful than they were, was the absence of any charismatic leadership. It isn't that there wasn't charismatic leadership in the Black community, it's just that it was regularly being sort of snuffed out, right? So you had the assassination of Martin Luther King, you had the murder of Malcolm X, you had the assassinations of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, right? So it seems like, just as soon as somebody came along who had the ability to sort of inspire and galvanize, those people were sort of taken away. Another factor that plays into a relative lack of success for the Black Power movement was the widespread introduction of drugs into communities of color. And then a fourth one, and this one's probably often overlooked, is that generally speaking, as a result of the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65 respectively, you did see actual improving conditions politically, socially, and economically as a result of that. And as conditions improve, the motivation for creating separate or sort of parallel set of social and economic structures starts to seem sort of redundant, right? If we're gaining, if people are gaining access to these things, within the broader and broadly shared structures of society, the need to create parallel structures for the community becomes less pressing. So kind of see that as a reason why there's less success among these kind of pluralist strategies that were employed by the Black Power movement. All right, so next time we'll talk a little bit about the Chicano movement, and we'll sort of follow the progress of that movement. And you'll see some parallels, but you'll also see some distinctions. So until then, I'll say take care.